Picture a incredibly sweaty Spanish governor in the year 1706.
Oh, man.
Yeah, he's just sitting at a desk in the middle of this sprawling, sun-baked desert, dipping his quill into ink to write a letter to the King of Spain. And in this letter, he is completely fabricating the existence of a bustling, perfectly organized town.
He is absolutely lying through his teeth to his boss just to get a promotion.
Exactly. I mean, if you've ever flown into Albuquerque, New Mexico, and looked down at that massive modern grid of asphalt and neon, you probably didn't realize that the entire foundation of the city rests on that one bureaucrat's lie.
It really does. It is the absolute definition of a geographical and historical anomaly.
Right.
Most cities grow logically, like a port is built, a grid is drawn, people move in. Albuquerque's history, on the other hand, is just this chaotic collision of scattered farms, violent rebellions, and total geopolitical accidents.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. We know you are curious and you want to really grasp the DNA of this place without drowning in textbook dates. Because today's deep dive is an epic journey through the history of Albuquerque.
A place with a lot more history than people realize.
Oh, for sure. A lot of people only know this city as the, sun-bleached backdrop for Breaking Bad. Or maybe the place where Bugs Bunny famously missed a left turn. But the real story here is wild, and it spans millennia. Okay, let's unpack this.
And to truly understand how all of those historical collisions happened, we have to establish one fundamental truth about this place right up front. Geography is destiny here.
Geography is destiny. I like that.
Yeah, if you look at a map, you have the life-giving waters of the Rio Grande cutting this narrow green ribbon right through the landscape, and it is completely surrounded by an incredibly isolating, harsh expanse of high desert.
Just miles of nothing.
Right. Those two geographical realities, the vital water and the isolating desert, they've dictated every single major shift in this region's history.
Okay, so our mission today is to trace Albuquerque's evolution. We're going to watch it transform from an ancient indigenous oasis to a Spanish colonial outpost, a Wild West railroad hub, and finally into the atomic and tech epicenter of the 20th century. So let's strip away the modern highways. How far back do the sources actually take us?
We actually have to go back roughly 12,000 years.
Whoa, 12,000.
Yeah. The earliest inhabitants of this area were Paleo-Indian hunter-gatherers. And we have hard proof of this because archaeologists have found what are called Folsom Points in the nearby Sandia Cave, sitting right alongside the remains of mastodons.
Wait, hold on. Why does finding a specific type of stone point next to a mastodon matter so much in the grand scheme of this city's history?
Well, because it proves this valley has been a continuous survival corridor since the last ice age. Folsom Points are incredibly distinct, fluted stone projectiles. Finding them lodged in extinct megafauna tells us that humans weren't just passing through.
They were sticking around.
Exactly. They were using the geography of this specific valley to hunt and survive long before recorded history. And over thousands of years, those nomadic people began to settle down. By the year 750 CE, a group known as the Ancestral Puebloans had developed complex agriculture.
Oh, and they were building massive multi-story dwellings, right? Like out at places like Chaco Canyon.
Yes, they essentially were ancient apartment complexes built right into the cliffs. They were brilliant architects and astronomers. And as we move closer to the modern era, around the year 1250, the descendants of those people, specifically the Tiwa people, settled right in the middle Rio Grande Valley.
Which is exactly where Albuquerque is today, because of that green ribbon of water you mentioned earlier.
Precisely. The river valley was a literal oasis. By the 1500s, the sources indicate there were roughly 20 Tiwa pueblos dotting a 60-mile stretch of the river.
That's a huge footprint.
And this wasn't just basic farming. They had engineered highly sophisticated irrigation systems to grow corn, beans, and squash in a really dry climate. They had a thriving trade network, lived in complex two-story adobe apartment structures. I mean, it was a highly developed, deeply functional society.
So you have this thriving, self-sustaining civilization just minding its own business, and I'm guessing this is where the Spanish arrive and completely upend everything.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. In 1540, the Spanish conquistador Francisco Vázquez de Coronado shows up. He's leading this massive, heavily armed expedition, just blindly wandering the North American desert.
Because he's obsessed with finding the fabled 7 cities of Cibola, right? The mythical cities supposedly made of solid gold.
Which obviously did not exist.
Yeah.
So instead of gold, Coronado finds the Tiwa people in what the Spanish decide to call the TX province. At first, the Tiwa actually traded peacefully with the Spanish.
Right.
But Coronado's expedition was totally unprepared for the reality of a high desert winter. It gets incredibly cold in New Mexico.
Oh yeah, people forget the desert gets freezing at night. So you have hundreds of Spanish soldiers starving, freezing, realizing they are totally unequipped. What do?
Rather than asking for help or negotiating, the Spanish forcefully commandeer one of the Tewa pueblos to use as their winter quarters.
They just took it over.
Literally kicked the indigenous inhabitants out into the freezing cold, taking all their stored food and supplies.
You can't just evict a population into a freezing desert and expect them to accept it. I mean, that has to lead to violence.
It triggered the TX War. It was a brutal, incredibly bloody conflict. The Spanish burned several pueblos to the ground and forced the surviving locals to flee into the mountains. That violent first contact really set a very dark, oppressive tone for the next century.
I can imagine.
Decades later, in 1598, another Spanish colonizer named Juan de Onate leads an expedition that permanently establishes missions and implements the encomienda system.
Okay, I've heard that term in history classes, but how did that encomienda system actually work on the ground?
It was essentially a state-sponsored protection racket. The Spanish crown would grant a colonist the right to demand tribute and forced labor from the local indigenous population.
Wow.
In exchange, the colonist was supposedly going to protect them and convert them to Christianity. But in practice, it was just a brutal system of subjugation. The Tewa and other Pueblo groups were forced to build Spanish churches, work Spanish fields, and give up their own meager food supplies.
Okay, if I had to put this into an analogy, imagine a massive, highly coordinated tenant uprising that successfully evicts a terrible, abusive landlord who has been stealing your wages for decades. Because that leads us right to the year 1680, right?
Yeah.
The Pueblo Revolt.
That is a remarkably accurate way to frame it. After decades of religious oppression, forced labor, and compounding famines, the indigenous people had enough. They united under a charismatic religious leader from San Juan Pueblo named Pope.
And the logistics of this are astounding.
Unbelievable. Pope coordinated a massive, synchronized strike across dozens of isolated pueblos. They used runners carrying knotted cords to count down the days to the rebellion. They rose up, drove the Spanish entirely out of New Mexico, and reclaimed their land for 12 years.
12 years. I mean, that has to be one of the most successful indigenous uprisings in North American history.
It absolutely is. But, the Spanish Empire wasn't going to let that stand. In 1692, they execute the Reconquista, militarily recapturing the territory. And it's in the aftermath of this return that we finally get to that sweaty Spanish governor you mentioned at the very beginning.
Ah, yes. The greatest fake-it-till-you-make-it moment in bureaucratic history. Let's get into Governor Cuervo y Valdés. What exactly is he trying to pull off here in 1706?
Well, Governor Cuervo wants to impress his superiors back in Spain and Mexico City, specifically the Viceroy, who held the title of the Duke of Albuquerque. And as a quick side note from our sources, early English speakers later dropped the first R, which is how we arrived at today's spelling of Albuquerque.
Good to know. So Cuervo names a town after his boss. Classic kissing up.
Oh, classic middle management move. But he wants to charter this settlement as a villa, which was a highly prestigious, royally chartered town status. But Spanish law was incredibly strict about urban planning. To charter a villa, the law required a minimum of 30 founding families.
Okay.
And you had to have a compact, easily defensible town layout centered around a plaza with a church and a government building.
But he didn't have any of that, did he?
Not even close. Cuervo writes this glowing official letter to the Viceroy, claiming he has 35 families, the streets are perfectly laid out, the church is fully built, and it's this beautiful, compact town ready for the king's blessing.
You're telling me he just blatantly lied to the Viceroy of Spain? There's no way you get away with that long term. I mean, someone had to have noticed.
Oh, they definitely noticed. An official inquiry a few years later, in 1712, reveals that Cuervo completely fabricated the report. There were only 19 founding families, not 35. And there was absolutely no compact town.
What was actually there?
What actually existed was a sprawling, disorganized string of sheep and farm ranches stretching for 2.5 miles along the banks of the Rio Grande.
Which honestly makes sense mechanically. If you're a farmer in a desert, you can't live in a tight little grid of houses. You have to spread out along the water to irrigate your crops and graze your sheep.
Precisely. The environment dictated the architecture, not Spanish law. These farmers only came together on Sundays to attend the small adobe chapel they built, San Felipe de Neri. The rest of the week, they stayed out on their ranches because they had to protect their cornfields and livestock from constant Apache and Navajo raids.
So Cuervo essentially pointed at a 2-mile stretch of terrified, scattered farmers and declared it a bustling metropolis. So if the town was essentially founded on an exaggerated resume, did that bureaucratic lie ever catch up with the city later on?
It did in a spectacular way, and this is why digging into these historical quirks really matters. In the 1880s, and then again as late as 1959, the modern, booming city of Albuquerque went to court to claim massive tracts of land and water rights.
Wait, based on what?
Their legal argument was based entirely on Cuervo's official 1706 Spanish charter. They argued that as legal heir to that original villa, the modern city owned all the surrounding resources.
You're kidding. They tried to use the fake letter to win water rights in 1959.
They did, and the courts frequently ruled against the city. Modern judges looked at the historical record and pointed out that Cuervo's original claims were fabricated, meaning the legal requirements for those Spanish land grants were never actually met in the 18th century.
That is wild. A bureaucrat's lie from 1706 costing a city water rights 250 years later. But it makes me wonder if the governor was just pushing paper, who was actually holding this fragile, sprawling farming community together during those early years.
We absolutely have to highlight the women of this era. Our sources show that at least 20 women are recognized as founding colonizers of Albuquerque. And this is where Spanish law actually provided a pretty unique mechanism.
Really? Like what?
Unlike English common law at the time, Spanish civil law allowed women to own and inherit property. Because the mortality rate for men was so high due to disease and raids, many widows became the heads of their households. They legally owned the land, managed the ranches, and actively sustained the community's economy.
So women were the vital economic backbone keeping this place from collapsing back into the desert. But even with that, it sounds like Albuquerque remained a pretty isolated agricultural outpost for over a century. How does it finally break out of that bubble?
The isolation really shatters in the 19th century because the flags start changing rapidly, which brings massive economic disruption. First, in 1821, Mexico wins independence from Spain.
Okay.
This is a massive shift because Spain had heavily restricted outside trade. Mexican independence suddenly opens the Santa Fe Trail, which connects New Mexico directly to American merchants. For the first time, a real cash economy floods into the region, replacing pure barter.
And then the Americans just decide to take it over.
Essentially, yes. In 1846, during the Mexican-American War, U.S. General Stephen Kearny marches his army into the territory and takes it peacefully. He sets up a U.S. Army post right in Albuquerque. And that military presence brings a sudden, massive influx of federal money, soldiers, and new settlers.
But putting an American Army post there also puts a giant target on the town's back during the Civil War. I was reading in the sources that in 1862, Confederate troops actually marched into New Mexico and captured Albuquerque.
They did, under General Henry Hopkins Sibley. The Confederates wanted to control the western trade routes and the gold fields in Colorado. But they overextended themselves. After losing their supply train at the Battle of Glorieta Pass, the Confederates were forced into a desperate retreat back down to Texas.
And there's a crazy detail about that retreat. As the Confederates were fleeing Albuquerque, they realized their cannons were slowing them down. So they secretly buried 8 mountain howitzers near the town plaza so the Union Army couldn't use them against them.
And those cannons sat under the dirt for decades until they were accidentally unearthed in 1889. Today, there are replica cannons sitting in Old Town Plaza, marking the exact spot.
Wow.
Now, it's worth noting that the history of that specific plaza has continued to be complex. Our sources detail that for years, there was a plaque there honoring a Confederate major with ties to a pro-slavery group, along with a Confederate flag flown alongside other historical flags.
Which obviously created a lot of tension in the modern era. And just to be clear for the listeners, we're just impartially sharing what the historical record in the sources says here, not taking a stance on the politics of it.
Exactly. We're just reporting on the artifacts.
Yeah.
But it became a significant flashpoint for public controversy. Ultimately, as the city navigated how to handle these layers of history in a public space, they decided to remove both the Confederate flag and the associated plaques in 2015. It just shows how even brief 19th century military occupations leave cultural footprints that a city has to wrestle with over a century later.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. We've talked about armies and trails, but the single biggest turning point for the city's design arrives on tracks of steel. 1880, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway finally reaches Albuquerque.
But the railroad company makes a decision that completely physically fractures the city. They don't build the train depot in the historic center of town where everyone lives.
Why not? Why bypass the town that's already there?
It came down to land prices and geography. The railroad surveyors realized the land near the old plaza was prone to flooding from the Rio Grande, and the local landowners were demanding pretty high prices. So the railroad simply bought cheaper, drier land a mile and a half east of the historic plaza and built their depot out in the scrub.
Which literally creates a new center of gravity overnight.
Exactly. A completely separate town springs up around the train depot. They called it Newtown, which is what we now know as modern-day downtown Albuquerque. And the contrast was stark. Newtown was built by recently arrived Anglo-Americans and European immigrants.
So they weren't building with adobe.
No, not at all. They imported Midwestern ideas, building Victorian brick facades, paved roads, and installing streetcars.
So all the economic power, all the businesses, the government offices, they all pack up and move a mile and a half east to follow the trains.
Leaving the original 1706 settlement to become known as Old Town. Old Town essentially fell into a deep economic depression. Albuquerque became a dual city, two distinct towns, completely separate in space, architecture, and culture. The railroad was the mechanism that violently yanked Albuquerque out of the frontier era and into the rapidly modernizing American machine.
And that machine just accelerates into the 20th century. Suddenly you have people flocking there not for farming, but for their health. In the early 1900s, the dry, sunny climate became famous for treating tuberculosis.
Yes, the sanatoriums.
Right, and then you have Route 66 getting paved right through the middle of the city, bringing this massive wave of auto tourism, motels, and neon diners.
You also have incredibly aggressive civic leadership at that time. In the 1930s, a local politician named Clyde Tingley essentially acts as a vacuum for New Deal federal funds. He builds parks, an airport, fairgrounds. He's laying down the infrastructure for a major city. But the event that truly drops the bomb, both literally and figuratively, on Albuquerque's growth is World War II.
Because of the Manhattan Project. But why Albuquerque? I mean, if the atomic bomb was being secretly developed up in the mountains at Los Alamos, why did Albuquerque explode in population?
Because of logistics. You can't just ship massive amounts of top-secret equipment, scientists, and uranium straight to an isolated mountain cabin. You need a massive, secure logistical hub with heavy rail access and an airfield. Albuquerque was the front door to the secret city.
Oh, that makes total sense.
The military established Kirtland Air Force Base to handle the flight logistics, which then led to the creation of Sandia National Laboratories right next door to handle the engineering of the weapons.
The influx of federal money and high-level scientists had to be staggering. I mean, between 1940 and 1950, Albuquerque's population nearly tripled.
It transitioned seemingly overnight from a regional railroad town into a premier, highly funded hub for military technology and scientific research. And here's the mechanism people often miss. Bringing thousands of engineers and physicists to the desert created a highly specialized talent pool. And that high-tech foundation is exactly what paved the way for the digital revolution.
I love this part because a lot of people have absolutely no idea that the personal computer revolution basically started in a strip mall in Albuquerque.
It's an incredible story. In the 1970s, a tiny local electronics company called MIT's, which mostly made calculators, managed to create what is widely considered the first commercially successful personal computer, the Altair 8800.
And a picture of that computer makes it onto the cover of Popular Electronics magazine, which happens to be seen by two young guys named Paul Allen and Bill Gates.
Right. They realize this machine needs software to be useful. So they call the owner of MIT's, bluff, and say they have a working program for it, and then frantically scramble to write the code. They actually fly to Albuquerque in 1975, demonstrate the software, and secure a contract.
So Bill Gates and Paul Allen literally moved to Albuquerque and found a little company called Microsoft, operating out of the city until 1979 before moving to Seattle. It's crazy to think about Gates writing code in a desert motel.
And while we're in the 1970s, we have to talk about the sky. The Albuquerque International Balloon Fiesta started in 1972 and is now this massive global phenomenon.
Though if we look at the sources, there's a pretty hilarious historical callback. The very first recorded hot air balloon flight in Albuquerque actually happened back at a territorial fair in 1882.
Let me guess, it went flawlessly.
Not exactly. The balloon accidentally detached and took off into the sky without its pilot.
Yeah, a slightly less organized launch than the hundreds of synchronized balloons you see today.
Yeah.
But listen, while the tech boom and the balloon fiesta paint this picture of a soaring futuristic city, we have to look at the mechanics of what this explosive post-war growth actually did to the physical layout of Albuquerque.
You're talking about the sprawl.
Massive sprawl.
Yeah.
The city expanded outward at a breakneck pace, driven by car-centric planning, cheap land and new freeways, massive suburban developments crept out toward the west side.
Like Rio Rancho and the big Intel plant.
Exactly. And as everyone drove out to the suburbs, the downtown area that Newtown the railroad created was completely drained of its economic vitality.
And the city's attempt to fix that in the 1960s and 70s was kind of a disaster. They called it urban renewal, but they basically just brought out the bulldozers. They destroyed almost all of the pre-1900 historic buildings downtown. They even tore down the Alvarado Hotel, which was this famously beautiful, iconic building, just to replace it with a flat concrete parking lot.
It was a top-down, really heavy-handed approach to urban planning that erased a massive amount of architectural heritage in the name of modernization. And that physical fracture mirrors some very real social fractures. Today, Albuquerque is a city of incredibly stark contrasts.
Right, because on one hand, you have this incredible influx of high-paying tech, renewable energy, and science jobs at places like Sandia Labs and the massive Intel plant.
But our sources detail that those high-paying federal and tech sectors haven't insulated the city from severe urban challenges. Albuquerque consistently battles very high crime rates. It has frequently struggled with being dubbed the car theft capital of the U.S., and there is deep systemic poverty in areas like the International District, an area locals have historically referred to as the war zone. It is a modern metropolis constantly grappling with the friction between rapid, cutting-edge technological advancement and lingering socioeconomic inequality.
Which brings us perfectly to the ultimate brilliant irony of Old Town today. Remember Old Town? The original 1706 settlement of adobe houses that got totally bypassed by the railroad and left to rot.
Yes. It sat completely neglected for decades. It wasn't even legally annexed back into the official city limits of Albuquerque until 1949.
But I realized reading through the notes that neglect is exactly what saved it. Because nobody cared about Old Town during the early 20th century modernization craze. Nobody bothered to bulldoze it.
That's so true.
The original adobe structures survived simply because the area was too poor to attract developers. When citizens finally realized its historic value in the 1940s and 50s, it was preserved and turned into this beautiful pedestrian-friendly tourist hub. But here is the profound irony. It is tiny.
It really is. It's roughly a 0.8 square mile island of preserved Spanish colonial history, and it is entirely surrounded by an ocean of endless modern suburban sprawl.
I was reading one description that said you can be standing in the serene 18th century plaza, look down the historic street, and your terminating view, the thing blocking the horizon, is literally a windowless Walgreens drive-thru.
It is the perfect visual metaphor for Albuquerque. Ancient history stubbornly surviving right next to a massive asphalt parking lot.
So what does this all mean? We've gone from ancestral Pueblones ingeniously farming a desert river valley to freezing Spanish conquistadors to a governor faking a town charter just to look good. We've seen how a railroad moving 1 mile east created a dual city, how the need for secret logistics birthed the atomic age, and how a calculator company sparked the founding of Microsoft.
It means that Albuquerque is a city entirely defined by paradoxes. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over regarding that geography we talked about at the very beginning. For centuries, the harsh, isolated desert and the narrow, fertile river valley were defensive mechanisms.
Right.
They kept the early inhabitants insulated, the desert protected them, limited them, and kept the wider world at bay.
It was a hidden oasis that you only found if you were desperately looking for water.
Precisely. But consider the deep irony. In the 20th century, that exact same isolated geography, the remote, highly secretive nature of the unforgiving desert, is precisely what made New Mexico the perfect location for the United States government to secretly develop the atomic bomb. And the massive infrastructure built to support that secret is exactly what brought the scientists who eventually ignited the digital age.
I never thought about it that way. The very landscape that kept Albuquerque hidden and isolated for centuries is the exact mechanism that thrust it into the absolute center of global history.
Exactly. It forces you to ask a really interesting question. Did Albuquerque change the world, or did the world just finally catch up to Albuquerque?
That is a fascinating question to end on. The next time you look at a map of this city, you aren't just seeing a grid or a sprawling metropolis. You are seeing the physical collision of ancient survival, bureaucratic accidents, and atomic secrets, all fighting for space in the desert. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.